Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. For those of you who are new here, my name is Miranda and I am the Enchantress of Avalon. So for today's Fairy Friday video, I have decided to take a look at the heroine of my favorite fairy tale, Aurora from Sleeping Beauty, of course. And I specifically want to talk a little bit about an alternate interpretation I really like of Aurora, and that is the question over whether she was a fairy all along. Now, obviously, we have a lot of fairies in the story of Sleeping Beauty. There are the good fairies who help raise Aurora in the woods, if we go by the Disney version. We also have in other versions even more fairies. There are versions where there are actually 12 of them, or where they're called 12 wise women. And of course, there is the most famous of all, the dark fairy, Maleficent. This is one of the villains books. This is the Mistress of All Evil. It's the Maleficent book by Serena Valentino. And there's another Disney Maleficent and Aurora centric book that's called Once Upon a Dream by Liz Braswell, and that's the Twisted Tales collection of books. And both give us some really interesting alternate timelines and alternate variations on both the characters of Maleficent and the characters of Aurora. So in both, you have these alternate versions of them. And definitely both really good reads. They're really fun. And the other thing that I'm going to be referencing is the Disney Maleficent films, where Maleficent is Aurora's fairy godmother. Like, yes, she has 3 fairies that are raising her, but as we see in those films, it was actually Maleficent that kept her from dying because the other fairies were a bit inept, which is of course different than your classic Sleeping Beauty, where Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather were her fairy godmothers and they took very good care of her. But I want to just take a little look-see at why Aurora was blessed in the first place. Why would Aurora have been blessed by all of these fairies? Yes, she's a princess, but why fairy blessings? In my opinion, she was being blessed because she herself had fairy blood. We might say that, well, her mother we know very little about. What if her mother was actually born a fairy? Or what if Maleficent was her birth mother? At least one of those books does take that whole thing into consideration. I don't remember which one it is, if it's this one, The Mistress of All Evil, or if it's the Once Upon a Dream Twisted Tale, but one of them does have Aurora as the daughter of Maleficent, meaning that Aurora was a fairy all along. But my thought is, what if Aurora's mother, who we know very, very little about, in both the Disney version and really any version, her mother's not really given much of a history? Well, what if that's because she was a fairy queen or a fairy woman that was married off to King Stefan? Or if we're gonna get away from the Disney version, the king, her Aurora's father. Why not? We have plenty of fairy tales and folk tales that do have fairy women marrying human men and bearing half-fae offspring. This is very common. I've talked about a lot of different versions of tales where fairy women marry mortal men and bear them half-fae offspring on this channel. There are a lot of fairy queens that are very famous for doing this, for coming to a mortal man as his bride and having children that are half-fae. We see this in fairy queens who are goddesses and in literary fairy queens as well. Famously, there is Rhiannon. She was a fairy queen and a goddess who comes to Dyfed, to the prince named Poole, and they end up getting married, and she eventually bears him a son, Pryderi. There is different variations where we could say that Igraine, the mother of Arthur, was herself a fairy woman, which is why Morgan, if she's her daughter, in certain variations she is, of course, is Fae, because Igraine was Fae, meaning that she's bearing children who have that same Avalonian fairy blood. So if we know that this was big in Celtic myth and legend, and in other fairy tales and folk tales that have come since, why can't we look at it as maybe Aurora was a fairy girl all along, a fairy, soon to be a fairy queen? She was specially chosen to receive all of these fairy gifts. Well, why was she chosen if not because she was already a fairy princess all along? At least that's my alternate interpretation. And yes, I do realize I've had a lot of alternate interpretations of fairy tales in classic literature saying, well, what if this character was a fairy? What if this character was a vampire? But I think this one's really interesting. I love the idea of Aurora being blessed with gifts because she was a fairy all along. Maybe even the sleeping curse, which is of course originally a death curse but becomes a sleeping curse, was to allow her the time to be asleep and be in that stasis where she could learn more about herself. Maybe that was when she was able to learn her true origins and to truly empower herself. I did an entire video actually on sleeping curses and fairy tales, and I have blog posts on my blog, whiterosofAvalon.life, that discuss sleeping curses and fairy tales and how they are more than just this character becoming, a non-entity in the story and not really taking part in the plot. They are a time for this character to develop. And usually when we're talking about Sleeping Beauty or Snow White, we are talking about a young girl who is coming into being a woman. But in this alternate interpretation of Sleeping Beauty, maybe she wasn't just coming into being a woman. Maybe she was coming into her own innate fairy abilities. And think about it, in all these different tellings, we have her very attuned with nature. We have her, when she is asleep, the castle becomes enshrouded by thorns and roses and brambles, this nature enclosing her and protecting her. In the Disney version, we famously have her living out in the woods amongst all of the animals and 3 fairies. She doesn't have human contact in that time frame. She's only having contact with fairies and with animals, and she feels so naturally ingrained in this and naturally a part of the woodlands landscape. Maybe it's because she was never really fully human herself. Maybe she was always half fae. Well, I do hope that you found some interest in this video. And if you did like it, please like, comment, subscribe. Check out my blog, whiterosofAvalon.life. And I will link some blog posts that relate to this topic in the description box below. And I will also link my Discord should you want to chat with me over on Discord and join in the discussion over there. And I'll also link in my donations page from my blog. I recently started a donations page for anyone who feels like they want to support me a little bit more. I do humbly ask for small one-time donations to enable me to continue creating content like this. So I hope you have a very fantastic Fairy Friday, everyone. Bye now.